Introduction. The setting and context. Romeo and Juliet is one of William Shakespeare's most famous and frequently performed plays. Written around 1595, it is a tragic love story set in the city of Verona, Italy. The play explores themes of love, fate, conflict, and the tension between individual desires and social constraints. It tells the tale of two young lovers, Romeo Montague and Juliet Capulet, whose relationship is doomed from the start because of the intense feud between their families. Act 1. The Feud and the First Meeting. The play begins with a street brawl between servants of the two noble families of Verona, the Capulets and the Montagues. The long-standing feud between these two families has spilled over into the public, creating chaos in the city. Prince Aeschylus, the ruler of Verona, intervenes and declares that further breaches of the peace by either family will be punishable by death. Romeo Montague, the play's male protagonist, is introduced as a young man who is hopelessly in love with a woman named Rosaline, who does not return his affections. Romeo's cousin Benvolio and his friend Mercutio try to cheer him up and convince him to forget about Rosaline. They persuade Romeo to attend a masquerade ball hosted by the Capulet family, hoping that he might meet someone new. Meanwhile, Juliet Capulet, the play's female protagonist, is introduced as a young girl on the brink of womanhood. Her parents, Lord and Lady Capulet, want her to marry Paris, a kinsman of the prince, who has expressed interest in her. Juliet, however, is not particularly enthusiastic about marriage, but agrees to consider Paris as a potential husband. That night, Romeo and his friends, disguised by their masks, sneak into the Capulet ball. As soon as Romeo sees Juliet, he is struck by her beauty and forgets all about Rosaline. The two meet and share an immediate, intense attraction. They speak briefly and kiss, but are soon interrupted by Juliet's nurse. It is only afterward that they both learn each other's identity, realizing that they have fallen in love with the child of their family's enemy. Act 2. The Balcony Scene and Secret Marriage. Despite the danger and the enmity between their families, Romeo and Juliet cannot resist their love for each other. Later that night, Romeo sneaks into the Capulet orchard and overhears Juliet speaking on her balcony, confessing her love for him despite knowing he is a Montague. Moved by her words, Romeo reveals himself, and the two exchange vows of love. This famous scene, known as the balcony scene, captures the passionate, youthful love that defines their relationship. Determined to be together, Romeo and Juliet decide to marry in secret. The next day, Romeo visits Friar Lawrence, a kindly and wise priest, and asks him to marry them. Although the friar is initially hesitant, fearing the consequences of such a hasty union, he agrees to perform the marriage in the hope that it might help to reconcile the feuding families. Romeo and Juliet are married in secret by Friar Lawrence, with only the nurse and Romeo's loyal servant Balthazar in attendance. After the ceremony, Romeo plans to visit Juliet in her room that night, while Juliet eagerly awaits the arrival of her new husband. Act 3. The Tragic Turning Point. The joy of Romeo and Juliet's secret marriage is short-lived. That afternoon, Tybalt, Juliet's hot-headed cousin, encounters Romeo and his friends Mercutio and Benvolio on the street. Tybalt, still angry that Romeo crashed the Capulet ball, challenges him to a duel. However, Romeo, now Tybalt's kinsman by marriage, refuses to fight him, trying to keep the peace. Mercutio, offended by Tybalt's insults and Romeo's refusal to defend himself, takes up the challenge instead. They fight, and Romeo tries to intervene, but his efforts inadvertently lead to Mercutio being fatally wounded. As Mercutio dies, he curses both the Montagues and Capulets, declaring, "A plague of both your houses!" Grief-stricken and enraged by the death of his friend, Romeo forgets his earlier resolve to keep the peace and fights Tybalt, killing him in a fit of vengeance. Realizing the gravity of what he has done, Romeo flees the scene as the prince arrives. After hearing what has happened, the prince exiles Romeo from Verona, declaring that if he returns, he will be executed. Juliet is devastated by the news of Tybalt's death at the hands of her new husband, but her love for Romeo remains strong. The nurse arranges for Romeo to visit Juliet that night, before he must flee to Mantua, a nearby city where he will live in exile. Romeo and Juliet spend their wedding night together, knowing it may be their last. Act 4. The Desperate Plan. As Romeo departs for Mantua at dawn, Juliet is heartbroken. Matters worsen when her parents, unaware of her marriage to Romeo, inform her that she is to marry Paris in just a few days. Juliet is horrified at the prospect and refuses, but her father, Lord Capulet, is furious and threatens to disown her if she does not obey. Desperate to avoid this unwanted marriage, Juliet turns to Friar Lawrence for help. He devises a risky plan to reunite her with Romeo. The friar gives Juliet a potion that will make her appear dead for 42 hours. He instructs her to take the potion the night before her wedding to Paris. When she is laid to rest in the Capulet tomb, the friar will send word to Romeo in Mantua, who will then return to Verona to take Juliet away when she awakens. Juliet agrees to the plan, and that night she drinks the potion. The next morning, her nurse discovers her seemingly lifeless body, and the Capulet household plunges into mourning. Juliet is laid in the family tomb, as the friar had planned. Act 5. The Tragic Conclusion. However, the message explaining the friar's plan never reaches Romeo. Instead, Romeo's servant Balthazar arrives in Mantua and informs him that Juliet is dead. Devastated and without knowing the truth, Romeo decides to return to Verona to see Juliet one last time and to join her in death. Romeo purchases poison from an apothecary and goes to the Capulet tomb. There, he encounters Paris, who has come to mourn Juliet privately. Paris, believing Romeo has come to desecrate the tomb, confronts him. They fight, and Romeo kills Paris. Afterward, Romeo enters the tomb and finds Juliet's lifeless body. Grief-stricken, he drinks the poison and dies beside her. Moments later, Juliet awakens from her death-like sleep, just as Friar Lawrence arrives at the tomb. Seeing Romeo's body and the empty vial of poison, Juliet refuses to leave with the friar. Instead, she chooses to stay with her dead husband. Juliet tries to kiss the remaining poison from Romeo's lips, and when that fails, she takes Romeo's dagger and stabs herself, dying beside him. The play concludes with the arrival of the prince, along with the Montague and Capulet families. The friar explains the tragic sequence of events, and the full story of Romeo and Juliet's secret marriage and its consequences is revealed. Overcome with grief and guilt, the two families agree to end their feud. They vow to honour Romeo and Juliet by erecting golden statues in their memory, symbolising the tragic cost of their enmity. Conclusion: Themes and Legacy. Romeo and Juliet is often regarded as the quintessential story of tragic young love. The play explores the intense, passionate love between Romeo and Juliet, which is as much about the impulsive, all-consuming nature of youth as it is about romantic devotion. Their love is pure and powerful, but it is also rash and fraught with danger, existing in a world dominated by hatred and conflict. One of the central themes of the play is the destructive nature of feuds and societal conflicts. The senseless feud between the Montagues and Capulets not only affects the lovers, but also leads to violence and loss within their families and the broader community of Verona. The play serves as a critique of the way in which irrational hatred and prejudice can have tragic consequences for all involved. Fate and destiny also play a crucial role in the story. From the beginning, the audience is aware that Romeo and Juliet are star-crossed lovers, destined to meet a tragic end. The play is filled with references to fate, fortune, and the idea that the characters' lives are governed by forces beyond their control. Despite their best efforts, Romeo and Juliet cannot escape the fate that the stars have decreed for them. Another important theme is the tension between individual desires and social obligations. Romeo and Juliet's love is a powerful force, but it constantly clashes with the expectations and demands of their families and society. Their secret marriage and subsequent deaths are a direct result of their attempts to reconcile their private love with the public world in which they live. Romeo and Juliet continues to be one of Shakespeare's most beloved and frequently performed plays. Its timeless exploration of love, conflict, and the tragic consequences of misunderstanding and hatred resonates with audiences across the world. The play's rich language, memorable characters, and poignant themes have made it a cornerstone of Western literature and a lasting symbol of the power and tragedy of young love.